Welcome to the Health Tech Crew podcast, where innovation meets health. I'm your host, Igor Gorlatov. Today, we're thrilled to have a technology transformer, Jen Cohen. As a seasoned veteran in the tech industry, Jen has been making technology work for businesses since 1990s. From sparking the software-first movement across the Toyota ecosystem to build cloud-based ecosystems for autonomous driving and robots, Jen's expertise is second to none. A fervent believer in people as the key to successful change, Jen has a heart for coaching, especially for coaching women in tech. Let's dive into this episode and discover how her knack for modernizing platform and streamlining processes has powered companies to success. Jen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
I'm super glad to be here. I've enjoyed our conversations on other topics, so I'm excited to be on your podcast today.
Perfect. I'm very excited as well. And let me start with my favorite question, which is, what do you get paid to do?
Well, today I get paid to be a digital technology strategy consultant, and I'm also a fractional CTO for 2 startups. So that's what I get paid to do today.
So let's talk a little bit about your career trajectory as a woman in technology. I'm sure there are a lot of pivotal moments. Maybe you could talk about a few of those.
Sure. So I will say I started my career when I was in college. I actually put myself through school by doing technology, although it didn't have the titles it has now. I did, IT, I did engineering, I did whatever I had to at kind of some startups while I was in college. And that led me to become a network engineer. I've done some development. I started managing technology teams in 1999. I always joke that I'm 24, so I'm not sure quite how those numbers work, but I've been in technology for a long time. And so for me, I started as a manager, but I also started as a hands-on manager. So I really kept my tech growing. And it's funny, I don't know anybody who's had a career trajectory that started and ended exactly on the path that they thought they would. So I moved up in technology. And at one point I made a transition to manage not only technology, but also operations at several companies. So I had IT and infrastructure, and I might have development, but then I'd also have, crazy teams for me, like billing, fraud and abuse prevention at one company, one internet company, accounting at one place. So different teams that maybe weren't in my natural career trajectory, but where I was hopefully able to help. And then over time, I went back to full engineering. So when I was at Toyota Research Institute, I went back to manage our core engineering group, which is shared services. That was things like data engineering and infrastructure engineering and software innovations. And then eventually I became CIO at Toyota Research Institute. And then last year I started my own company, and I've been doing consulting for Fortune 500 as well as for startups, and nothing in between at the moment, but just those kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum. But it's been fun because you'd be surprised how much the same lessons apply to both companies. You just implement them slightly differently.
I really love how you said that trajectory is never predetermined and it always changes. But I have this assumption I come across, and I might feel myself, that in terms of building a technical career, you need to start with super technical skills. And as you level up or go through the ranks in the organization, you start building your people muscles. And at some point, it's more about people versus technical skills. What's your take? Do you agree with this assessment? And two, how important are people skills early on?
So I would say that while that was my trajectory, I started with technology and grew the people skills. I will say, for me, I grew up with parents who had small businesses of their own. And so one of the things I always look at the lens of technology is through business and through people. Technology needs to serve business, and people need to be able to adopt it. And they're not going to if you don't have people skills to translate that. I think one of the things that I find disappointing in technology is that we don't acknowledge that when somebody's going from a technologist to leading a group or managing a group of technologists, that's technically a career change. It's an entirely different set of muscles you're using. So I do think it's critical in management and leadership that you have those skills. But I think that folks kind of pick them up as they go. And I really would love to see more mentorship of how do you make that switch, right? How do you keep your technical skills and your credibility in that space, but grow the muscle around management, around people? Because if you don't have people on board, it kind of doesn't matter what cool technology you build. So I'd love to see us change it. And one of the reasons I do mentorship is that I've watched so many people who were fantastic technologists shoved into a management role and then say, I never want to do this again because I failed at it. But nobody gave them the structure or the help along the way. So I really try to, help folks where I can, because there's some brilliant technologists that can be brilliant leaders, but we have to help them to build that part of their career just as passionately as we all read our O'Reilly books and, took boot camps. We need to do the same thing when we're making that switch into management.
As you mentioned, you help people as a mentor, and I'm always curious, and I know mentorship is very kind of one-on-one specific. Everyone has their own journey, their own set of challenges, but are there any themes or any gaps that a typical technical person faces when they get promoted into a leadership role?
Yeah, I think there's a few themes that I've seen, and one is, how to give feedback. It's one thing to do a code review. It's another to give feedback on performance. It's not the same tactics or way you might approach it. I think I've also seen folks who are really comfortable with, I don't mean confrontation in a negative way, but like pushing back on an idea that's technological versus having that tough conversation with somebody. And I tell this story, and it's 100% true. I worked at one company, and there was a woman who did the wrong thing for 19 and a half years, and nobody told her, and they laid her off. And she got a new job, and she got fired after 6 months because no one told her that she'd been doing something wrong. So when she got to the new place, she didn't realize what she was doing was not only not best practices, but it just wasn't good to be doing. So I really think of feedback, and I try to coach people to think of feedback in a different way. To me, feedback, when you care about the person and you care about their development, you're giving them the opportunity to grow. And by not giving that feedback because we might be afraid of confrontation or how it might be received is really a disservice to the folks that we're working with and who are working for us. And so I think that's a gap I see frequently is, how do I give feedback? How do I like this person? I don't want to hurt their feelings. How do I do this in a way that really helps them to grow? And so I think that's not a muscle that naturally goes from code review, right, to giving feedback. It's not a natural way to do it. So I think that's one of them. I think for a lot of folks going into tech, from tech to management, they're of both genders, I see, or all genders, I see imposter syndrome. I'm coming from being a tech, now I'm being asked to be a manager, or I've been quickly promoted to director, and I don't even know what that means. So how am I achieving it? So really helping people to put some structure and scaffolding around it and feel more comfortable and feeling a little less imposter syndrome. So I see that a fair, but as well, I think it all comes back to, if we don't prepare people to be in those roles, then we're really doing them a disservice when we put that way. People want to grow. They want to try these things. We need to give them the right set of tools to be successful.
And if you are already a leader or a senior person, how do you kind of turn your success into significance through mentorship? What's your kind of recipe?
Well, so for me, there's two things that really supercharged my thoughts on mentorship. And one is that I had two fantastic female mentors in my career. There's not a lot of women tech leaders. So the fact that I had two, I feel a little greedy. I was pretty lucky. And at the same time, my oldest daughter, she is a technologist. She graduated from college. She just got her first UI UX role as a developer. And what I don't want to see happen is that she has the same experiences that myself and some of my coworkers have had. So I've really tried to pay it forward for the mentors who helped me, figuring out how to navigate being one of the few technical women around the table, or just being one of the only women around the table at all. I want to give them tools. And so that's really where my approach started. And then it's interesting, different companies, different positions. There's a lot of the same patterns that I see that women are having. And so I try to come at it from the perspective of, how do I help them to work through those patterns and find the best way they can approach it in their environment. So that's what got me into mentoring, and then kind of the approach that I take.
Can we get a little bit more granular? Like, if you have a potential mentee, how do you approach them, or how do they approach you? How do you set expectations for both parties? And is it like open-ended, or is there like a timeline for this relationship with the specific goals? Like, what has worked really well for you?
So a couple of things I'll say is as I've mentored folks, I have like collected tools and things that I think are helpful that I use. So I kind of have that collection. And in general, people come to me. I've given advice here and there, but free advice is free advice. So whether or not somebody wants to take it's up to them. But when somebody knocks on my door, somebody I work with, or somebody I've had a few people come across LinkedIn, usually women in technology who are struggling with moving forward or certain elements in their role. We have the conversation that they're looking for mentorship. If it's in my wheelhouse, I'm glad to help them out. There's times that there are things that are not something I'm as familiar with. Maybe it's not in the tech world, or it's not in an area where I can be of value. So we see if there's value, and then I kind of work through it. I have a method, but I don't know if it's always obvious on the outside. My thing is to kind of learn and understand where they're at, where they want to be, and where the challenges are, and then use things I've learned or things others have taught me to kind of help them along the path. One of the things I'm super passionate about is women in technology, and women are leaving technology leadership at an advancing rate every year. And I show sometimes in my speeches this picture of a woman at a board table. And I ask people, who do you think, what role do you think that woman is? She's in the C-suite, what role? And I'll let your listeners, think for a second of who that might be. And invariably I hear CHRO, because 57% of Fortune 500 chief human resources officers are women. Sometimes I hear CMO. I never hear CTO, CIO. It never happens. And what I would love to have happen from my mentorship and other folks work in this space is that when you see that picture of a woman at a board table, you think, I think that's the CIO. I think that's the CTO. I'd love to change that perception. And so when I'm mentoring, I'm also trying to think of how do we help these women be seen as strategic, help them move to that path so that they're on the C-suite, they get to boards. And I don't mean nonprofit boards, which every woman I know gets asked to be on, but private or public company for-profit boards. I think it will make a huge difference in what we do, but I also think it makes a huge difference for the women coming up behind them.
I think you've touched in several answers on this topic of women in tech. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this. And I I appreciate your examples, and we come across these examples in many places. This is like an important conversation happening in society, but I'm curious, in your experience, could you share some specific unique challenges you faced as a woman in technology throughout your career?
Yeah, I actually have a whole speech called I Am the IT Guy, because quite frankly, people assume I'm not. I've had, times where I've had to cover for somebody who's out and their technician comes from the telco and they're saying to me, well, we have to wait for your IT guy. And I have to say repeatedly, no, but I am the IT guy. Like, this is as good as it's getting. I'm here. You're gonna have to deal with me. And invariably by the end of those conversations, they're asking me for career advice. I always find that kind of funny. So I think, first of all, there's just an assumption a lot of times made that the woman around the table isn't necessarily technical. I have a friend who has a PhD in computer vision and machine learning. She's got patents. People are working on her things. She went to a new company and she was immediately assumed to be a new product manager by people she met. And I thought that was so interesting. Like, I don't know where that assumption comes from. They're working on things that are her patents and her ideas with no idea. And so the assumptions that they had looking at her, how do we change it so that when somebody sees a woman, we are the IT guy. It's not the assumption that we're not. And so I think that that's pretty common because there's not a lot of us. And, it's growing a little bit, but if you look at things like the very, very tippy top of leadership, CIOs in the Fortune 500, it's something like, I think it's 24% are women, only 18% of CTOs in the Fortune 500 are women. So we definitely are dropping off. And so my goal is like, how do I help make that better? But those assumptions, I've sat around a table and had people assume I'm not technology. And I will say, one company I worked at, I had a CEO who would hear me on the phone with some of our technology companies. And it's a long story, but we had the telcos who were dropping our service and all of us in the team would get on the phone. And he noticed that every time I was on a phone call with these guys, I would drop something technical really fast so that they would know that I knew what I was talking about. I didn't even know I was doing it. It was learned behavior for having to justify that I actually do this for a living. And so I had no idea until he observed it. But now that I see that, I actually see women doing it all the time, having to drop that validity into a conversation that I don't see, other parties having to do. So I hope that was roundabout, but I hope that answered your question.
Did. And I just recall I work for Kepler, which is a women-led company. I'm a minority stakeholder. Our CEO is a woman and our CTO is a woman. So it's like Olga and Olga. And I did observe this dynamic when they would have a meeting and a conversation. and it's almost like some people feel they can take advantage of the situation, or they don't treat them like the way they would treat me when I enter the room. And
Yeah.
I was blown away because I didn't experience it like as directly as through interactions in that role. So I can totally relate. But coming back to the point that you made about lack of women in leadership roles, and we had a little bit of a discussion about this when we prepared for the conversation. And I wanted to ask, where do you think the drop-off happens? Is it at the school level where just women do not go into technical fields? Is it at mid-career level where women choose not to pursue those like paths that require a lot of sacrifice and kind of really being competing with other women and very competitive men? Or is it at the top that just they are not like there are enough of those super qualified, super competitive, equal women, it's enough. They're just not being selected. There is a bias against them. Or is it a combination of this?
So I think it's a combination. And so I will say I'm going to speak at a conference next week. And I was talking to the conference organizers, and it's women in data is essentially the theme. And they get a lot of early career and a lot of senior career. They didn't get almost no one in the middle for attendees. And frankly, I see that. I see women who drop off midway through. Now, I do think there's pipeline challenges. If we only have so many come in, we're only going to have so many come out. When my daughter started her first semester in college, she was in her computer science class, and a friend of mine who'd been coding went to school in the 80s, and she said, "How many women, how many men?" And it was 40 people, and 4 of them were women. And that was exactly the same. My daughter and this woman from the 80s, same stats. And so it hasn't, I don't think it's changed on the pipeline side. I think we need to do more there. But what I do see is I see women going in really enthusiastically and hitting different kinds of barriers, and less about competitive and more, in my opinion, a bias, as well as kind of a lack of support. It's a surprise a lot when you're a woman in technology as opposed to being accepted. And I think what happens is not so much that I don't see it as a competitive thing, because I haven't actually seen that be the case. What I've seen is women who are tired of hitting their head against the walls and decide to go do something different, whether that's a different field, whether it's start their own company. I see a lot of women who are frustrated. And look, when you're the only woman around the table, it's easy for things to be said. It's easy for you not to feel like you have a place. And over time, that becomes wearing. And so I've seen a lot of women leave in that same mid-career. This is the only thing I can do. So I didn't have a choice. If I wanted to eat, I needed to keep working, and I needed to make sure that I was, and I wanted to excel in my career. But I'm not going to say I haven't had those same feelings. And I'm not going to say that I hadn't, at times thinking, what am I doing? Why am I hitting my head against these walls? So I do think that's a big part of it. And I think the more that we support women and just diversity in general, like we know more diverse companies, have better profits, have better products. We know that we need not just diversity of gender, but diversity of all kinds to make really good solutions for the future. I don't see that yet in how we're working. And I think that can just get exhausting. I've had people, make all sorts of comments. We talk about the IT guy, but I've certainly seen a lot of others. And I'll talk about, there's a woman who's a CIO in Ireland, and she went to this big meeting, and when she walked in, the first thing that happened, she was probably I believe she's the highest ranking person in the room, but 2 gentlemen asked her to make them a cup of tea. And, she did, to her credit, and they were chagrined to their credit. But those assumptions, while they aren't meant to be harmful, over time, it gets really exhausting. So that's my personal thoughts on it. What I will also say is we saw in 2022, 14% more women tech leaders leave the industry than did in 2021. And it wasn't a small number in 2021. So it is happening that folks are leaving out of a variety of frustrations. And we don't want to see that, continue.
Thank you for giving such a deep answer. I'm curious, as you are working with women as a mentor or coach, or just through your consulting engagements, what have you found to be particularly effective for those mid-career women to help them get to the next level and not give up?
I think there's a few things. I think one is almost all of those women, because they're getting these comments, start to get this imposter syndrome. I think there's also, mid-careers when women have children. I have a number of women I've talked to who think, there's this one woman I worked with. She was a lawyer. Actually, she wasn't in technology, and she'd had a baby 6 months prior. And she's like, I'm getting it all wrong. I'm getting it wrong at work. I'm getting it wrong at home. And she's seeing these Instagram posts, right, with a woman with the perfect house. I'm like, you don't see that woman's messy kitchen. You don't, you're seeing one slice of her life. I think some of it is the expectations we put on ourselves for everything to be perfect and this idea that everything can be balanced. And I really believe that life is full of choices, and sometimes work comes first and sometimes kids come first, and you're constantly having to evaluate those things. But putting this like perfectionism on ourselves whilst we're seen as others is not helping us. So really being honest about where we're at and being kind to ourselves in that space. And then I think also finding ways, I didn't give up, even though everybody said I was the IT guy. I found ways of dealing with it. Sometimes it was humor, like I am the IT guy. I actually have that t-shirt. So literally there's a t-shirt for it. So I'm not the only woman who's had to say it. Finding ways to, instead of being defensive about it, finding ways to go on the offensive of like really focusing on what I'm outputting, making a joke when those things happen, but still making somebody aware that it's happened. So giving them different tactics. So it doesn't feel like these things are happening to you, but it feels like you can, take some action. It's not 100%. It's not going to solve every problem doing that. I don't want to put all that burden on women, but I think there's things we can do. I think the other thing is that we don't always honor the successes we've had, right? We go on to the next one. And then it feels like you're always on to the next thing. And if you don't feel appreciated or if you feel othered, and we haven't taken a second to take a breath and look at what we've done and acknowledge and honor the commitment and the work and the success, it just becomes more and more exhausting. So I really coach around that too. So those are some of the things. There's also specifics at each company with each woman. So, I'll keep it very general, but does that help answer? Is that?
I think so. I think this is perfect. And I liked your idea of going on the offense and kind of using this as a way to kind of surprise people and also challenge people's thinking in the moment without offending them, but kind of highlighting, because it creates a positive narrative for me as a person inside a system that is geared somewhat against me. Like, how can I hack this system? So I like that perspective, because if I'm just, I don't know if you were the one who said it, but there is like a stereotype, angry woman or angry Black woman, and you put a label and you can ignore whatever that woman is saying. So kind of getting outside of the stereotype while still pushing for change. I think this is powerful.
I think it's powerful. I also think it comes with a grain of salt, right? Because I did that. And I think in our pre-talk, I talked with you about, I have a friend I went to college with, and we both started our IT careers at the same time. And while I've spoken truth to power, it's been maybe not always loved, but it's been accepted. It's been heard. And when she speaks truth to power, she's seen as an angry Black woman, and she's not. She's speaking a total appropriately toned, really good advice. And because of how she looks, those assumptions are being made. So I think it is a tough one. And the advice I give may not, suit everyone, but I've moved further in my career than she has. And that's not right. Quite frankly, she's smarter than I am. So she should be, further along. And so I'd love whatever we can do to kind of break down those stereotypes. And I always think that, they're missing her voice. She's really, really good point. She's done some amazing things, and it's a shame that they're missing her voice because of assumptions that don't really matter. So I do try to, turn it around in my world. Everybody's situation is different. So I want to acknowledge that too.
Thank you for highlighting it. So it's more than just being a woman. It's about being a woman of color, and that might be a different journey.
I think it's probably a different, and from the stats we see, a more difficult journey. And so wherever I can be supportive, I do my best, but I also want to, acknowledge I don't have that experience. So, yeah.
So let's talk about this modern term called fractional CTO, or fractional Chief Technology Officer. So you position yourself, at least on LinkedIn, and that's how I found you, that you can act as a fractional CTO. So who needs a fractional CTO, and at what point would an organization need one?
I think the challenge with startups, and I've worked at Fortune 500s and I've worked at startups, and the challenge with startups is, things are lean. Like, let's just call it what they are. Like, you do not have unlimited funding, things are lean. And so I think it's really tough, especially if you have a non-technical founder, to have, to get really quality CTO with the budget that you have, right? And on top of it, it may not be the most interesting full-time job for a CTO. So what I think for startups, I think it's getting that kind of senior experience. And what I find with startups is a lot of times, they have, because they have budget constraints, they might have more junior developers or more junior architects, and they need, some of this experience. They don't need it full time. And as a fractional CTO, I would also say, I want to do other things. So it kind of is the match made in heaven, and that I get to go into companies and help them, build up their team, help their team to grow, both experience and size where appropriate, and, help with the architecture, put in best practices. But I don't have to do that all day. I can go do that for different orgs. I get to see the growth of people, which I absolutely love seeing. I get to see the growth of the product and help with that. But they don't need me 40 hours a week. And I don't necessarily want to do that 40 hours a week. So I get to have a taste of both worlds. I get to do my work with the Fortune 500, kind of digital technology strategy, so DX and that kind of thing. And then I get to help these smaller companies on their path. So I would say it's a startup that, in general, if you have a startup that has a technical founder, you may not need this. Or if you have a technical founder who's really, really into some of the other subject matter of the company, this is where supplementing with a fractional CTO can be really valuable. And I do that for 2 companies right now. One is called Quick Organics. They're in the best way I can say it is that they're like TurboTax for organic certification, which turns out, as I'm learning, to be far more complicated and something that, these farmers are having to deal with that I had never thought about when I buy my organic apple, right? So there's a lot of work to make that easy in the field. And then I'm also fractional CTO for a company called 100% Capacity. And that company, my teams at Toyota Research had gone through this next level innovation leaders program. And when the founder and I are friends, and we were talking about like, how do we make this a platform? How do we get this to more people? And as we started talking about it, this fractional CTO role developed so I could build the SaaS that leverages this innovation program to really help companies move forward. So I'm having a blast doing both. And I think for them, they don't have the overhead of a full-time CTO, but they get all the benefits. So
Sounds awesome. I'm putting myself in the shoes of a founder, not technical founder, and I'm not technical. I was lucky to have a super technical co-founder for my startup, and I'm lucky to work with more technical women at Kepler. But if there is this non-technical founder on the journey to build something really cool, what is the right point on the journey when at least talking to a fractional CTO would be a good idea? Is it like day one, or after you raise some money, you validated your idea? Like, is there a formula, or it depends on each situation?
I'm sure it depends on each situation. What I have found is there's kind of 2 places where I've come in. One, I came in at pretty much the founding with 100% Capacity, and the idea was already validated because we were doing it. When I left Toyota, that program was continuing. It was still being done. It had legs. It just didn't have a platform for it. So for that was validated in a way because it already had customers, but it wasn't validated on a technological level. I think with other companies, it could be that they're getting to that point where they're outgrowing their talent skill set. So they've been able to do a proof of concept or a pilot, and they're looking to kind of get to that next place where it's something paying customers are going to use, it needs to scale. And I think that's a point where it's great to bring in a fractional CTO to look at the architecture, to look at the process. Every company puts in Agile multiple times that's using it, right? And so a startup might start with their first version of Agile, and now that they're getting bigger and they have more demands from their board as they've raised more money, they're looking to how do we smooth this out? How do we make this better? How do we commit, to these different markets that we want to be in? And so I think where you see a gap is when to bring us in. And so in the case of 100%, that happened to be a little bit more organic, but we could see the gap. With Quick Organics, they were starting to grow and looking for different things that they wanted to do with their technology, and they could see a gap where they don't necessarily need someone with 30 years experience every day. They do need some of that kind of sprinkled in there to make the process a little easier. So I think it's when is that gap? And what are you not quite getting out of your technology that you want to? It's a great time and a way to see the value, because ultimately when I come in, I should be delivering value. And so if I'm not helping to close that gap, then you probably don't need me. Not to talk myself out of work, but you probably don't need me. But when you have that gap, that's the time.
Thank you. I appreciate this very tactical guidance. And is it reasonable to expect a fractional CTO to work for equity in my startup?
I think everybody is different. I will say I have been in the Valley a long time, and I never do equity alone. Here's the thing. I've had equity come in to be very nice things in my life, and I've had equity where I've lost money. So, where I've invested in stock and it hasn't worked out. So my thought is always, pay me what I'm worth. And if equity happens to be a part of that, great. But there has to be some amount of cash. And the other reason there has to be some amount of cash is you have to have something on the line. And what I mean, and equity is later. You have to have something on the line right now, because if you're paying me to help you do things, but then you don't take the advice, or we don't do the things that are recommended, it's not really fun for my time, but also you don't have any skin in the game. So I know also that I've seen the flip side of fractional CTOs who are like, I want half the company. That's too far, right? So I think that having a blend of either cash or cash and equity is kind of the best of for both sides, even though it might not seem it when they're writing that check.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for giving this insight, and that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to touch upon on your strategic work because somehow you seem to work with startups as well as Fortune 500 companies. So before even going there, how do you get Fortune 500 companies as clients as a essentially small consulting firm?
Well, I would say, and I wish there was a different answer, but referrals. People who know me, have worked with me at other places, know what I'm up to, or that I've connected with through different organizations. I'm a member of Chief, a women's, executive organization. I've met some folks there for that, where we realize we have similar experiences or similar challenges, and I might be able to help. Or through my career, I've worked at different startups. I've also worked at Toyota Research Institute, Cisco, and Birkenstock. So I've kind of got a weird mix, but it means I know a lot of folks. And so the work has really come when somebody, again, sees a gap and knows that it's something I can help with. I wish I could say I have all the lead gen things to do, but it's not my strength. And I have somebody who helps me with as a revenue officer. But at the end of the day, it's really come through word of mouth. And even the fractional CTO came from a board member of Quick that I happen to be she happens to be a CTO, and we were at a women tech leadership dinner, and that's how that came across. So I will say almost all of my business, and I didn't necessarily realize this when I started a business, has come through referral.
And what's your typical offering to this huge corporation?
So with the huge corporations, a lot of times it's funny, I'm being brought in for similar things at a different stage. So it's, we're doing digital transformation and we're having challenges. We're not, we're spending money, but we're not getting the results we want. A lot of times I come in and there's gaps in definition of done. There are things that folks have wanted to do, but maybe skip steps in their excitement that are necessary. So one of the things I see a lot is missed is change management. And while I can do that, what I do a lot of is what I call tech executive coaching. So really helping the execs to get these projects on track and to get their involvement in it to be right sized so that they can be successful. And then have those basics like definition of done, metrics for success, that sometimes we, in our excitement to use technology, and I love technology just like everyone else, but sometimes in our excitement, we skip those steps and it can cause challenges. And so what's fun about the Fortune 500 is it does move slower than a startup, but the dent and the impact you make is larger. And so that's kind of what I enjoy. But I will say working with different startups, not the ones I'm working with now, but definition of done, like same thing for the product as it is for a digital transformation at a Fortune 500. Those missing pieces or those pieces that are too light end up causing a lot of hiccups along the way. So, and then I'll also mention, I also do some coaching and some work. I do a program to kind of help build your women tech bench. So how do you retain the women you have that are technical, and how do you bring more in? So I do that. I do charge for that, but I will also say it's like my passion project. I absolutely love helping with that. And it's all the tools I learned kind of growing up in tech along the way. So those are kind of the three things that I do. Keeps me busy.
Oh, I'm sure it does. And I love that this passion for promoting women and empowerment in that space, in the space of technology, seems to be a common thread.
It does. It absolutely is throughout my career.
I want to linger a little bit more on this Fortune 500, because bigger organizations are usually somewhat political or even more political, and there are some entrenched interests.
Yes.
What's your advice for navigating this environment? If you come in as an external consultant, where you have like a little bit of relationship, so they let you in, how do you get buy-in from the larger organization and ensure that you are heard and your input is implemented?
So I think the number one thing, and it sounds so easy, and it's actually the same thing that folks who are trying to push these programs internally can do, and that is listen. I think the hardest thing is when we have an entrenched idea, we want to move it forward. And sometimes in our excitement, and I've done it, so I'm not going to say I'm not guilty. I've not done it as a consultant, but I've done it as an employee. It's like you get so into pushing it forward that it's sometimes easy to skip hearing concerns or even just letting people be heard. And so in terms of the politics, they're different at every company. So I don't have like the magic formula that applies to every company, but the listening is really where you start to see where the different camps are, where the objections are, where the legit concerns that we need to address are. Because I think sometimes folks hear objections and there's emotional ones, like we're humans, we don't like change, even though it's constant, we don't like it. But there are sometimes really important things we need to find in those objections. And I will share at one company I went to, they were midway through this when I got there. There were objections from IT and buyers at the shoe company that the product wasn't going to be able to manage or order shoes by size. They put it in anyways, and it tanked their company, and they ended up being bought out after many rounds of layoffs. So they had, change resistant objections that maybe weren't legit. And then they had some legit objections that they didn't listen to, and it cost them a ton in the end. And they ended up ripping out that system, that ERP system, and I helped them put a whole nother one in that could manage shoes by size. And if you think about it, as a shoe company, you kind of need to know what you need to order and what you need to ship. And if you can't do it by size, you're in trouble. So I think I see that way more commonly than you might think, that listening is being skipped, the change management components are being skipped because they're not the fun. I mean, let's be honest. I live in the land of driverless cars. That is tech that is sexy. Change management, people aren't thinking about that so much, but you have to do, if you want to do one, you got to do the other. And so a lot of what I'm doing is hearing and then starting to manage that process. And then the other thing I see a lot of, and I don't want to pick on anyone, but is that like big consulting companies come in and say, oh, we'll do it for you. And the techs get less, or the executives get less involved. And what I really find is that we need to get them more involved, and that's what moves things forward. So that's the formula I use. Others may have a different one, but those components are the same every company I go into. And frankly, they're the same even in startups. You need the same thing with involvement, change management, listening to objections, and managing change resistance. So like that kind of balancing act.
I like the example with the shoe size, like for a shoe company, kind of not listening so much that even critical things get glossed over. And I like how you differentiate yourself, like from companies, like bigger companies could come in and say, we'll do it for you, versus let's do it together. So I love it. Thank you for sharing. Let's touch upon health tech a little bit.
Yes.
And I know you don't have like plenty of experience in that, but you have some. And we talked about two aspects, like owning that you're passionate about, owning our own data and leveraging robots. Can you talk a little bit on your perspective on those topics?
Sure. I'll start with the robots because I think it's the funner thing to talk about. So when I was at Toyota Research Institute, they were and are working on robotics to help elders age in place. And it was, I don't have a lot of healthcare experience. That's not my background. But one of the things I thought was so interesting was listening to some of our PhDs who were out there interviewing the elderly in Japan through AARP, and we're finding that our assumptions weren't necessarily the problems they wanted to have solved. And one of the things that Toyota does a great job with is this concept of ikigai, this, that life needs to have meaning. And so one of the things they started approaching this kind of how do you help the elderly is how do you empower them? How do you help solve the problem, but not take away the things that they love to do? And how do you really hear and listen to their needs? And I think about healthcare, and there's things in healthcare that I think are fantastic. And there's things where I think, do they ever talk to their users? And I'm sure I can't be the only person who sat in the doctor's office waiting for an hour, wondering if they're thinking at all about their user or customer experience. And I suspect some are and some aren't. But that same thought of like, how do you really hear from the users what they need? I judged an innovation challenge that was around using APIs and that company's hardware, to help the elderly. And the startups that did the best in that challenge were the ones who really understood what the elderly needed instead of saying this is what they need. And so I think I would really love to see more of that. And as we went into the pandemic and we could do things like telehealth where you don't have to sit in the doctor's office, it's like, whew, finally love this. How do we do more of that, that's answering the needs, not just that the healthcare companies have, but that the patients have? And so that's something I think about a lot in relation to any product we do, but I think healthcare, it's so much more personal. It's so much more important. So that's that part. And you asked about records.
Owning our data.
Yeah, I think I don't spend all my time in Web3, but one of the things I got excited about when I heard it was thinking about my healthcare records. When you want to change doctors, that process, I would think I'd rather fill out tax forms than go through that process again. And I don't want to fill out tax forms either, but it was such a painful process. And, we move data around all the time, right? We're doing amazing things with data we didn't do 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but I literally have to get like a paper stack or a CD, and I have to go through 20, signing a paper to do it. How come I don't own that? It's my medical data, right? Like, how do I own that? How do I keep a hold of that? I don't have the answer, but I feel like there's a real need for this. I know somebody who moved countries, getting her medical data to the new country's doctors, not an easy process. It shouldn't be, I can get my passport and take it anywhere why are medical records so hard? And I know HIPAA is a part of that, but I think there's something more we can be doing there. So I'm excited with all the cool technology we have these days. I'm excited to see what comes next, and I hope that problem goes away. So those are, I'm not an expert in health, but those are kind of my thoughts.
And thank you for sharing. I have more like personal questions left. One is, what is the book, or what are the books that you're currently reading?
So there's one behind me, and I have to hold it up. The founder of 100% Capacity, my friend Jen, wrote this amazing book called The Innovation Mindset. I absolutely love it. It is fantastic. And I think every company right now I'm hearing about is doing two things. They're trying to cut and they're trying to innovate. And I can't speak to the cut, but I can talk about that this really helps with innovation. And coming from a research institute in the Valley, like how you approach innovation is something I've learned is really important. And so her program, I think, is fantastic. I also think for women, and we were talking about kind of, women and mentoring. I think this book by Tissa Richards, No Permission Needed, is really good, a way of thinking about how you approach things, and instead of asking for permission of ourselves, of others, how we move forward and not do that, not let that hold us back, especially as women leaders. So I really like these two. And then, personal, I'm reading whatever, sci-fi or mystery book I happen to be reading at the moment. But these are the ones I would recommend.
This is awesome. What's the most exciting project or initiative that awaits you in the next 6 to 12 months?
So I can't completely talk about it, but there's like everybody else, I've got a project that I'm architecting with using generative AI and really using that in a way that it hasn't been done before. So I'm very excited about that. I love the concept of generative AI. I don't feel kind of the same as everybody else. I don't see a lot of doom and gloom, and I don't think it's going to replace everything. I think how we, just like everything else, how we implement it matters. But I have an exciting project in that space that I'm working on. And then I'm also doing a new keynote called Groupthink and Tech Disasters. So really talking about that intersection of where groupthink gets us in trouble, how that affects large companies, and how the exit of women technologists has really amplified that. So I'm doing some work in that space that I'm really excited about as well.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I have one last question, and it kind of connects back to the mentorship discussion we had. If you could send a tweet to your younger self, what would the tweet say?
Do I have to qualify how many characters that tweet is?
Up to you. It can be just advice, a message.
I think the advice I would give is just, for the longest time, I thought being hard on myself, like being brutal to myself, was how I was successful. And I actually had a friend challenge that, and it's something I've really worked on the last few years, and I'm certainly not perfect about it, but I think I would say, your drive doesn't come from being hard on yourself or from having negative self-talk. Your drive comes from your passion, and let that go. Because I think of all of the things I've said to myself, I would never say to someone else, right? And a million years, if I heard someone say it, I would say, don't do that. But I didn't do that for myself. So I wish I mean, that's something I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. I wish I'd learned that way far earlier. I don't know if I'd have been able to hear it when I was younger, but I wish I'd heard that sooner, or even if I'd heard it, that I'd taken it and taken action on it. And I think that's not just me. There's lots of women I know who are like brutally hard on themselves, but I don't think it really ties to their success. I think it's something we do that really just harms ourselves.
Thank you so much, Jen, for your time and wonderful insights you shared.
Oh, glad to share. So good to talk with you. Thank you. I'm really honored that you had me here today. Thank you.
What an enlightening episode it's been. Jen Cohen's dedication to making technology work for businesses and her people-centric approach is truly inspiring. Whether it's adopting new solutions, transforming systems, or mentoring the next generation of women in tech, Jen's influence on the industry is far-reaching. If you are in a startup aiming for scalability, looking to overcome operational hurdles, remember it's all about people, and with the right tech, you can achieve amazing things. Stay tuned for insightful episodes on the Health Tech Crew podcast as we continue to explore the intersections of health and technology.